The Holy Gospel as it is recorded in Mark. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter, and Jesus said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of Christ. Please be seated. The anonymous gospel storyteller that we call Mark provides us with the shortest of the four Gospels, just 16 brief chapters. But don't let this fool you. The writer of this account of the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth packs more action into his short gospel than any of the racy novels, spy thrillers, mystery novels, or tell-all biographies that you can find today on Amazon. Today's reading occurs barely halfway through our anonymous storyteller's account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And already Jesus has been baptized in the River Jordan, been tempted in the wilderness by the evilest of villains, Satan himself. Jesus has gathered together a motley crew of disciples, and he has cast out demons, cured lepers, healed the sick, the lame, and the blind. Jesus has preached to the multitudes, appointed apostles, and he has even been restrained from preaching by his own family because his family feared that he had gone out of his mind. Jesus has turned away his own mother and brothers in favor of teaching to the crowds of people who gather to hear this itinerant preacher because they want to know what he has to say. Jesus has taught the crowds in parables, calmed the stormy sea, and if that wasn't enough, he brought a dead girl back to life only to be rejected and scorned in his own hometown of Nazareth. Jesus has had to face the death and decapitation of his cousin and fellow evangelist, John the Baptist. He has somehow managed to feed 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and 2 measly fish. And to top it all off, Jesus, this walking, talking, healing, miracle-working superhero, he's managed to walk on water. In just 6 brief chapters, this anonymous gospel storyteller we call Mark has painted the picture of a mythical superhero, a man of the people who is capable of amazing feats of daring do. Not even Superman or Superwoman or Spider-Man or Wonder Woman, Batman, Catwoman, James Bond, or Laura Croft could match the heroic deeds of the anonymous storyteller's amazing Jesus. Our storyteller's Jesus is a superhero's superhero. In many ways, the picture of Jesus keeps our mind's eye far away from understanding just who this itinerant preacher who somehow managed to change the world actually is. According to our anonymous storyteller, Jesus really is some kind of supernatural, superhuman being. Jesus is a hero beyond all other heroes, whose abilities are beyond the bounds of the natural order of things. Our hero who stands head and shoulders above the rest, that's Jesus in this story. A superhero whose abilities, sensibilities, wisdom, knowledge, and kindness are beyond those of us who are but mere mortals. And if this was all there was to our storyteller's Jesus, then there really wouldn't be much of a story here at all. You see, as long as we see Jesus as superhero, supernatural, or superhuman, then following Jesus is no more demanding than following our favorite superhero in a comic strip. The exploits of these heroes, they may be interesting, intriguing, maybe even enlightening. But each and every one of us knows that we cannot do what they can do. We may be able to follow their exploits and applaud their heroism, but we cannot be like them any more than we can do what they do. They are, after all, superheroes, heroes whose abilities are beyond the average mortal. Indeed, I'm sure that many of us follow Jesus in much the same way as we follow the exploits of the other heroes we have set for ourselves. We admire Jesus. We trust Jesus. We may even wish that we could be more like Jesus, and we are even willing to listen to some of the things that Jesus has said. But when it comes to following Jesus, we often let ourselves off the hook because, after all, look at what happened to Jesus. They nailed him in the end, and if it weren't for intervention from on high, Jesus would never have escaped the clutches of death. Fortunately for us, there is more to our anonymous storyteller's gospel than there is to the story of the average comic strip superhero. You see, unlike the average superhero, Jesus is all too human. In today's story, Jesus is a flesh and blood, down-to-earth, fallible, short-tempered, and sometimes narrow-minded human being, very much like the rest of us. In this story, Jesus' humanity is revealed. Jesus has just finished teaching and feeding a huge crowd of some 5,000 people. And after dismissing the crowd, he and a few of his followers, they climb aboard a small boat and head off to the other side of the sea. Jesus goes ashore alone and retreats to a mountaintop to pray. A storm picks up and Jesus walks across the water and calms both his followers' fears and the wind itself. When they get ashore, Jesus is quickly recognized by the waiting multitudes. Crowds of people seek out this wonderful hero. This hero with a healing touch. And he cures many of them. And while taking a break, Jesus engages in a theological debate with the religious authorities who cannot understand why this ragtag bunch of Jesus freaks are making such headway with the people. No matter where he goes, Jesus cannot escape the crowds of needy people who seek his help, nor can he elude the religious authorities whose constant questioning is designed to trap him. So Jesus goes to a place where he should have been safe from the prying eyes of those who want something from him. He leaves the land of Israel and goes away to the region of Tyre and Sidon, a land that is inhabited by Gentiles. Now surely Gentiles would leave this Jewish rabbi alone. According to the story, Jesus entered a house and did not want anyone to know that he was there. No doubt he was tired. He needed a rest. And Jesus seeks a little break from saving the world around him. Who wouldn't? But even in a foreign land, Jesus cannot escape notice. Jesus' fame has spread far and wide in an age when only word of mouth can fan the flames of notoriety. It seems as though even the Gentiles have heard about Jesus' miraculous powers. We're told that a Gentile woman entered the house where Jesus was hiding out. This woman must have been desperate because her daughter's affliction drives her to ignore all of the rules of propriety. She goes alone into someone else's house and she approaches a male guest. Now, even if we forget she is a woman and ignore that according to the rules of the time, women were not permitted to speak directly to any man, let alone a Jewish man, we must remember that this woman is named as a Syrophoenician. Now, the animosity between the Syrophoenicians and the Jews would hardly have allowed for polite conversation. It's difficult for us to understand the feelings of revulsion that Jews had towards these particular Gentiles. Jews only spoke to Gentiles when it couldn't be avoided. And when a Jew had contact with a Gentile, that Jew, it was said, was unclean and was not permitted to take part in any social gatherings, especially worship. And it would have been considered an outrage for any Gentile woman to approach any Jewish man, let alone a Jewish rabbi. Jewish women would not approach a Jewish rabbi. Not in public, not like that. But this Syrophoenician woman is so desperate. Her concern for her daughter's plight pushes her forward into someone else's home where she does the unthinkable. She bows before Jesus and begs him to cast a demon out of her daughter. Now, this is hardly Jesus' shining hour. Up until this point in the story, Jesus has performed all kinds of superhuman deeds. But Jesus is tired. And he responds in the most human of ways. Jesus responds to the woman's pleas not with kindness or with sympathy, but in the same way that you or I might respond if we're tired. Jesus snaps back at the woman with an insult. Jesus lashes out with a well-known racial slur. Everyone in that room would have known what he was saying. Jesus insists that the children must be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, our English translation misses the rudeness of Jesus' insult. In the original Greek, the insult is clear. Jesus calls the woman a dog, a female dog. It seems that calling an insistent, persistent woman a female dog goes all the way back to Jesus' day, and it would have sounded as harsh as it does today. Why is it that even now, strong, bold, persistent women continue to be dismissed as female dogs? Now, to be kind, we could simply say that Jesus is having a bad day. So this Gentile woman, this bitch, who has dared to approach Jesus to plead for his help, is offered nothing more than an insult, and Jesus declares that his time and energy must first and foremost go to the children of Israel. to his own tribe, and not to the dogs, not to the bitches. But despite Jesus' harsh words and attitude, the woman refuses to be silenced by his insult, by his racism. This woman persists. This woman defies social norms, and she engages Jesus in debate. The unnamed woman's passionate persistence is a force to be reckoned with. She reminds me of so many women that I have known over the years. Women who, in a moment of despair or hopelessness, women in the throes of rejection, who have found the courage, the personal resilience, the faith, the courage, something way down beyond themselves to stand in the midst of their adversity and to make their voices heard. Women who refuse to keep silent even though all of society say that they should. Women who dared to go against the grain and dared to be open to something new and different. Instead of withdrawing and fading into the background, this woman, for the sake of her daughter, refuses to be daunted by Jesus' insult. She turns Jesus' racist slur upside down and insists that even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And suddenly, our gospel storyteller loves the word suddenly. Suddenly, Jesus, as tired as he is, has to rethink his own position. Jesus must struggle with this woman's words. The way our anonymous gospel story tells this story, it seems that Jesus realizes for the first time that his mission wasn't only to the Jewish people, that in addition to his own tribe, in addition to all those multitudes in his own homeland, Jesus must also meet the needs of foreigners whose habits and customs appear offensive. Jesus has to begin to think the unthinkable. Through his encounter with this persistent woman, Jesus has to begin to question his own attitudes towards those of other races, other tribes, other lands. And then Jesus has to make a decision, which requires great courage, because he knows that if he associates with Gentiles, he will be despised by the religious authorities and run the risk of being judged as unclean. In this ever so brief little story, the anonymous gospel storyteller we call Mark gives us a glimpse of Jesus, the human one. Now let me remind you that in Greek, the title that is translated from our Greek New Testament into the English New Testament as Son of Man is actually in Greek ton anthropos, which does not mean Son of Man. It means human one. In Greek, there is a perfectly fine word for man. The word is anir. If the writer wanted to say Son of Man, he would have said anir. But instead, the writer says anthropos, which means humanity. Every time you read Son of Man in the New Testament, hear the human one. For some reason, biblical literalists, they refuse to translate this particular phrase literally. Wonder why that is. But our anonymous gospel storyteller is very specific in his portrait of Jesus, the human one, and his reaction to an encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. Gone is the superhero. Gone is the brilliant debater who can overwhelm his opponents in any verbal joust. Gone is the energetic, miracle-working, wise, gentle, kind, soft-spoken superhero none of us could ever measure up to. Here in this story, Jesus is a weary rabbi who finds himself accosted by one more needy person, a person who, according to all the rules, he shouldn't have to had to deal with. A person who manages to take Jesus' insult and turn it around on him. A person who somehow knows that her daughter's need of him is far greater than his claim that he is not responsible. And suddenly our superhero is all too human. So human that he responds to the needs of another with anger and resentment and even an insult. So human that for the only time in the scriptures, Jesus loses an argument. So human that Jesus realizes that he must actually change his mind. So human that Jesus must be willing to grow. So human that Jesus must realize that no matter how much he would rather not be the one called upon to help, no matter how many good reasons there were to ignore the pleas of the needy, Jesus comes to realize that he must broaden his horizon. So human that Jesus is able to accept the Syrophoenician woman's challenge and open himself to her teaching and to do the unthinkable. So this all-too-human Jesus responds to this woman's pleas for help, and Jesus tells her that the demon has left her daughter. Now, I don't have enough time to go into the ancient understanding of demons or their perceived relationship to illness. What's important here is not whether or not Jesus performed a miracle. This story is not about a miracle. This story is about the nature of Jesus, the human one. This all-too-human Jesus has walked a mile in our shoes. This Jesus knows what it means to struggle to understand what he must do. This Jesus knows what it means to grow weary, to seek refuge from the constant demands of life. This Jesus knows what it means to have to expand his thinking, to include everyone, even those that his own people despise. I find it so much easier to identify with this human Jesus than with Jesus, the superhero. But there is a great danger in identifying with this human Jesus. You see, Jesus, the superhero, is really very safe, whereas this all-too-human Jesus is incredibly dangerous. After all, none of us can be expected to follow Jesus, the superhero. None of us can be expected to work miracles. So we can safely admire Jesus, the miracle worker, without ever expecting that we are called to walk in his shoes. But Jesus, the human one, the one who walks around in the flesh, just like us, the one who knows our pain, our struggles, our desires, our needs, and our ways, this one is so much more demanding, so much more dangerous. This one calls each of us to search ourselves so that we can open our own hearts and minds. This one calls on us to think the unthinkable. Thinking the unthinkable is difficult because it always feels as though the unthinkable is directly opposed to everyone's expectations. Those who dare to think the unthinkable nearly always find themselves just as Jesus did, rejected by the establishment, especially in the early days when the unthinkable is very new and very strange. It was once unthinkable to say that the earth is round. And so the church persecuted anyone who suggested that the earth was not flat. It was once unthinkable that humans could fly. It was once unthinkable that women should not only have a voice, but also the vote. It was once unthinkable that children should ever speak unless they were first spoken to. It was once unthinkable that a country could or should survive without capital punishment. It was once unthinkable that women could be priests. It was once unthinkable that men could or even should offer tender and loving care to their children. It was once unthinkable that men should be nurses or women should be doctors. It was once unthinkable that divorcees could remarry in the church. It was once unthinkable that a lesbian could be your pastor. There are many things that remain unthinkable. For many people, it's unthinkable that we should have to concern ourselves with the needs of those people who haven't had the good sense to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make something of themselves. For others, it is unthinkable to suggest that we should make restitution to those whose land and culture our ancestors stole. There are others who think that it's unthinkable that we should be called upon to make sacrifices so that people whose only crime was being born in poverty can be fed, clothed, housed, and live with dignity. Some people believe that it is unthinkable to vote for someone who promises to raise our taxes so that the poor can be fed and housed, hospitals can tend the sick, and schools can educate children. And this week, as the anniversary of September 11th approaches, so many of us continue to believe that it is unthinkable to expect terrorists to respond to justice and mercy rather than to force and violence. Jesus thought the unthinkable. Jesus healed the Gentile woman's daughter, and he went on his way. And it didn't take long before Jesus was confronted by yet another person's needs. Still deep in the heart of Gentile territory, the crowds bring before Jesus a man who is deaf and has a speech impediment. And they beg Jesus to lay hands on him. And we don't need to get hung up on whether or not the anonymous storyteller is writing about a man who is physically deaf, or whether or not it's this kind of deafness that symbolizes all those who, like us, fail to hear, or that his speech impediment is like our inability to speak out. What is important to our storyteller is the change in Jesus' attitude. What is important is that Jesus, changed by his experience with the Syrophoenician woman, doesn't even hesitate. There is a man who needs his help, and Jesus heals him with his touch. Ephphatha, be opened. Be opened. Open your hearts, open your minds to the needs of those around us. No matter how tired or weary we may be, regardless of whether or not we've heard it all before, Ephphatha, be opened. Be open, and like Jesus, dare to think the unthinkable. Hear the cries of our sisters and brothers and participate in their healing. Ephphatha, be opened. Amen.